Hello, and welcome back to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we dive into a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is January 4th. Today we're looking back at a case that deeply unsettled Boston in 1964, the tragic murder of Mary Sullivan. This story on its own is both heartbreaking and horrifying, but it became part of something much larger, the Boston Strangler murders. Today, we'll walk through the details of Mary's death, how it connected to this infamous case, and the long, winding road that finally led to answers. Let's get started. It was January 4th, 1964, when Boston police discovered a scene that would end up haunting even the most seasoned investigators. Mary Sullivan, just 19 years old, had recently moved to the city to start a new chapter in her life. But that day, she was found murdered in her Charles Street apartment. The scene was awful. Mary was found propped up on her bed, a scarf tied tightly around her neck. There were clear signs of sexual assault, and to make this crime even more disturbing, a Happy New Year card had been placed at her feet. It seemed to those at the scene that the killer was taunting whoever would come across her body. The news of this murder spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the city. Mary was just so young. She was starting out in life, and for her to be attacked in her own home, a space that should have been safe, was just beyond terrifying. Mary was new to Boston, and her friends and family were left reeling, just trying to make sense out of this event that couldn't make any sense. While investigators had very few clues at the beginning, they did have an idea of who may have committed this brutal crime. Now, to understand what investigators were thinking and the weight of Mary's murder, you have to picture what Boston was like in the early 60s. For nearly 2 years at this point, the city had been gripped by fear. An unknown killer was targeting women in their own homes, often strangling them with items like stockings, and in many cases without sign of forced entry. The press had even given this killer a name, the Boston Strangler. When Mary Sullivan was found, it wasn't immediately clear if her murder was connected to the Boston Strangler. After all, most of his victims had been over 50, which made Mary an outlier. She was only 19, remember, and the Boston Strangler's oldest victim was in her 80s. Plus, the staging of the body, especially that New Year's card, was different from what investigators had seen before. So they were left wondering, was this another victim of the Boston Strangler, or was this a new killer mimicking him? Or a third option, was this the same killer who was just changing his pattern? Detectives poured everything they had into solving Mary's murder. Perhaps more than they would have if the Boston Strangler hadn't been terrorizing the residents of their city. They searched her apartment for evidence, canvassed the neighborhood for witnesses, and followed up on every lead. But the killer had left little behind in the way of evidence. There were no signs of a struggle, and no obvious clues pointing to exactly who had done this. The lack of forward momentum was a devastating blow to police who were already under immense pressure to catch the Boston Strangler. Now, with another murder on their hands, the fear in the city only deepened. Time went on, and the case grew cold. Some detectives were convinced that Mary was the Strangler's youngest victim, while others believed that her murder could have been the work of a copycat. But with no definitive evidence, the mystery surrounding Mary's death only seemed to grow, until finally there was a breakthrough. Later that same year, 1964, a new name entered the picture: Albert DeSalvo. DeSalvo was already in jail for a series of sexual assaults when he suddenly confessed to being the Boston Strangler. It was a bombshell, to say the least. Here's somebody who had a history of breaking into homes and attacking women, but he had never been linked to any of the murders until now. DeSalvo claimed responsibility for the string of killings that had paralyzed Boston, including Mary Sullivan's murder. But things weren't so straightforward. His confessions were riddled with inconsistencies. He got some details wrong even, which made investigators question whether he was truly the strangler or just some nutjob seeking notoriety. To complicate matters further, DeSalvo was never formally charged with the murders, including Mary's. Instead, he was only tried and convicted for those previous sexual assaults. To the public, though, despite the lack of a conviction, DeSalvo became synonymous with the Boston Strangler. So after that, many believe the case was closed. But for a large segment of the public, including Mary's family, doubts lingered. Was DeSalvo really the man who took her life, or was the real killer still out there? For decades, Mary Sullivan's case remained technically unsolved. Then, in the early 2000s, advancements in DNA technology brought new hope. Investigators revisited evidence from Mary's murder, including samples collected at the scene, to see if modern science could finally provide answers. In 2001, initial DNA tests revealed something shocking. The DNA on Mary's body did not match Albert DeSalvo. So this seemed to support the theory that DeSalvo wasn't the Boston Strangler, or at the very least, he didn't kill Mary. So the case went dormant once again. But then in 2013, DNA technology had improved once again, and so investigators decided to take another look. This time, they tested DNA from one of DeSalvo's nephews, and those results were conclusive. The seminal fluid found in Mary's body showed a familial match to DeSalvo's nephew, leading them straight back to where they began, Albert DeSalvo. With this breakthrough, authorities officially closed Mary's case, naming DeSalvo as her killer. It was a resolution that brought some clarity, but also raised lingering questions. Why were his earlier confessions so inconsistent? And what had driven him to commit such brutal crimes in the beginning? And how was he arrested for sexual assault, but not for these murders? Though Mary's murder was solved, questions still surrounded the other murders, with many believing that they were actually the act of more than one person. During those years of terror in the 60s, Boston was a city on edge. Women felt unsafe in their own homes, and police were under immense pressure to catch a killer that always seemed to be one step ahead of them. While Mary's case is officially closed, the legacy of the Boston Strangler remains one of Boston's darkest chapters, a time when an entire city's sense of safety was shattered. Albert DeSalvo himself was killed in prison in 1973 when he was stabbed by another inmate. This happened after he had actually escaped from an earlier prison and was transferred to a maximum security facility. He died decades before they connected him to Mary's murder, taking any secrets that he may have had directly to the grave. Thank you for listening to this episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If today's episode resonated with you, please subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with others. I'll be back tomorrow with another crime that happened on this day in history. Until then, stay safe and take care. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!